Welcome back to another edition of Racing Rundown here on YouTube. I'm Eric DeCoster, and welcome back to another Kentucky Derby contender profile as we break down Reincarnate, the Avengers entrant in this year's Kentucky Derby. Of course, that's what the ownership group that employs Bob Baffert as their trainer and has switched their horses to Tim Yakteen over the last years refers to themselves as two, and that's valid because there's like 20 of them, so it'd be hard to go through and list them all off. But regardless, Reincarnate, a nice horse, a horse with a good Grade 3 win, kind of a good Grade 3 win, I should say, and then two runs that have some excuses, but are they really enough to move him up in this year's Kentucky Derby? Reincarnate, 7 starts, so he's pretty well seasoned. He's hit the board in every single one of them. I mean, he remains competitive in every single race, and he's got the breed and the build and the breeding to carry him a long way in this year's race. So let's dive in and let's start with our pros. The first thing that he's had some valid excuses for his recent losses. You know, it took him 4 starts to break his maiden. Did a few on the turf purely to get some distance because at the time there weren't many 1 mile 2-turn dirt races for him. So they ran him on the turf just for that reason. Got him on the dirt, ran well third time out. Then he broke his maiden nicely at Del Mar. Then he won the Sham, which I'll kind of wheel back to in a minute, before these last 2 races. But starting with the Rebel, which was 2 starts ago in late February, he completely got, caked out at the break, basically. He didn't really miss it, but he was a little slow in his stride. So it took him a while to get going. And because of that, he got outrun early. There was a lot of pace tied on to that race. And because of that, they went pretty quick up front, and it hurt Reincarnate's chance after getting jostled around early on. So he was coming from pretty far back in that race after sitting in the first 3 of each of his first 5 starts. So already an excuse there. But nevertheless, he sat off the pace, showed a new dimension for the first time in his career in a very unexpected scenario, and rallied really well. He finished a good closing third behind Confidence Game and Red Route 1. Now, one caveat is going to be that Red Route 1 was coming from further back than him and still, beat him. Confidence Game was not and still beat him. So there's a little knock there, but all things considered, it was a good performance. I felt from Reincarnate to show that new dimension. However, I don't think it's his best. In the Arkansas Derby, they tried to put him back in his spot, which is being up front. However, there was a very quick horse in there named Two Eagles River who has real good sprinter speed that he could occasionally stretch 2 turns. Well, he was in there, goes to the lead, more inside draw than Reincarnate, so established that real position. And that didn't necessarily take Reincarnate out of his game, but it wasn't his best work. And also the pace was on the quicker side. The fractions might not reflect it, but the speed did not hold up there in the slightest. Reincarnate dug his heels in as best as he could to stay around, despite the speed backing up pretty easily, and gutted out a very close third. He was only ahead in front of Rocket Can there, only a half length off of second. So it was a game effort, but once again, comes from further off the pace than he wants in the Rebel, close to a hot pace last time out. So 2 valid excuses there. And I think that kind of goes down to my third point, which is that every year I try to find a horse that fits this mold. A horse that hates passing, but hates being passed. A few years ago, Midnight Bourbon and Medina Spirit both fit that bill, and Midnight Bourbon kind of, he had his own troubled trip, but regardless, we kind of saw it reflected throughout his career that he was a horse who, if he could make the lead, he'd be so tough because he would work as hard as he could to not let that horse pass him. But if he had to set up second or third, he wasn't going to go by you. If you saw the horse in front of him, forget about it. If you saw the horse next to him, I'm not letting you by. One of those things. Medina Spirit was the same way. This year, that horse does seem like Reincarnate because you look at his wins, you look at his best performances. If he makes the lead, he is gung ho on keeping it. His maiden win was the same way. His win in the Sham was that way. I think even go back to his first start, he lost by a neck, and I mean he tried his butt off every single step. And I think even you look at the Rebel, he picked up some ground obviously, so that kind of overrides the hates passing thing. But point is, he's not going to win a race doing that kind of style of running. The Arkansas Derby, it was kind of the same thing. He got passed by Angel of Empire because he'd been softened up so much, but then he dug his heels in. Once King Russell went by him, he found another gear. Once Rocket Can was with him, he did not let Rocket Can go by. So he hates being passed, and for that reason, not listed maybe, but I think if this horse makes the lead, he could be a little tough in this year's Derby. We've talked a bunch in a lot of our individual profiles, and we'll talk a lot about it when this race is drawn up and we go and handicap it horse by horse before giving out our final picks, likely to come out the Tuesday after the draw. So I believe that would be May 2nd. Just a quick little plug there, but point being, we're going to talk a lot about the lack of pace in here. If this horse gets a favorable draw, able to make the front, he's going to try his hardest to keep himself around because he hates passing, but he hates being passed just as much. So if he can put himself on top, clean air in front of him early on, it's going to be tough for people for people to run him down. And I don't think that should be overlooked heading into this race because that's exactly what Johnny V did 2 years ago on Medina Spirit. Sure, they got taken down, but of course, regardless how the race was run, I was a horse who hated being passed. And finally, Reincarnate, he loves to run. I mean, he can run all day. Bob Baffert, we'll probably get him back after this Kentucky Derby for the other Triple Crown races. And he's already said this is my Belmont horse. He said it after the Sham Stakes back in January, which I'm going to fully dive into in a second. I know you're probably all sitting there, oh, Eric, you got to talk about the Sham. That's what he won. I'll get to it. But when he said after Sham Stakes, this is my Belmont horse. This horse can run all day. And that's true. And that's never going to hurt you leading into a mile and a quarter race like the Kentucky Derby. When other horses may have some distance questions, you're not going to. So that's going to be a big benefit to this horse. All right, let's look at the Sham Stakes. Of course, his biggest career win, his biggest career buyer, his biggest career Brisnet, his biggest career time form, all the bigs. But here's the thing about the Sham. It was kind of a sham because it was a 5-horse field. Most of those horses were his stablemates. He was not necessarily handed the lead because he worked kind of fast, which goes back to the hates being passed point, but he beat only his stablemates. And those horses did not come back to really flatter themselves on the Derby Trail. Newgate came back to win the Bob Lewis Sherpa. Then he beat an entire field of his stablemates, so I can't really glean on that too much. And then he beat National Treasure, who did struggle in the Santa Anita Derby and other preps. So, it was not a big win, and I think the figures kind of not indicative of the true quality of the race because I don't think it was that huge of a performance as it might indicate. And we know that the California figures for dirt routes tend to be a little inflated for these 3-year-olds. So I feel like it was one of those races because in his next two, it was kind of proven that way. And also, it kind of leads into my next point about the figure regression, which he threw a 95 buyer in the win in the Sham. But then he stepped all the way down to a 90 in the Rebel. And then an 86 in the Arkansas Derby. Was that, obviously that figure regression, which you hate to see. It feels like he's climbed a mountain and then, descended down it with his buyers. If you look at our progression here, he went from, the 2 turf starts there, the 72 and the 68, but then breaks his maiden with the 80, or runs a good second, with the 80, breaks his maiden with the 84, peaks with the 95, and now he's going down the mountain with the 90 and the 86. You don't want to be going that way leading into the Kentucky Derby. I mean, that's just facts of the matter. You need a horse that's consistently improving, or at least, even if it's incremental, getting a little bit better. So that's bad. But also, if that figure is a sham, well, if that's closer to maybe a 90, then maybe he didn't really regress that much. Maybe he just ran the same race at the Rebel. Maybe it was a very similar race to the Arkansas Derby. Maybe the Rebel was actually a better race, right? That's just the problem with figures in general. But point being, I don't think that figure is, the regression's concerning regardless, and it's matched by others. It's not just Beyer. Time Form and Brisnet showed slight regressions, but it was to a much lesser extent. For instance, Brisnet only had the Arkansas Derby 2 points worse than the Sham, and the Rebel was actually the worst of the 3. So there's no longer regression, and from that standpoint, it's okay, slight dip with a tough trip in the Rebel, and then back to a very similar number in the Arkansas Derby. So you have to really love that. So all things considered, it's hard to get a read on the figures, but if you're going off buyers alone, the regression there on the figures is concerning. And then finally, no wins in deep races. We talked about the Sham Stakes, concerning, and then he ships out to Arkansas, and then he's just a little bit of a cut below behind Confidence Game and Angel of Empire, albeit with some slight excuses, but a cut below nevertheless, and he could be the same way on Derby Day. So a horse that I think has some intriguing qualities. I think the connections obviously know what they're doing coming into the Kentucky Derby. I don't think they'd be running him in the Derby if they didn't think they had a chance with him. And I think that if he's able to make the lead, he could be dangerous to, at least hit the board. Obviously, he could draw terribly and that change everything, or be surrounded by speeds or something like that. But I think he's a horse that you have to consider from the pace aspect. But then is he good enough? That's something that you have to take into configuration with the figures and the lack of quality wins that he has. It's the way game. What do you value more? How does that affect how you pick this Derby, how you handicap this Derby, how you ultimately will play this Derby? So a horse that, he'll be a little bit of a price, not a huge one, but one that you have to do a deep dive into and weigh those different pros and cons more than most in this race, in my opinion, because they do all hold a lot of weight. That's all I have for you guys in this Kentucky Derby Contender Profile. We'll see you next time here on Racing Rundown.